Okay, Steve, if you want to just go ahead and introduce yourself, your background, and what brings you to the Spectrum Summit today, and then we can segue Darrah in when she gets in.
Sounds good. Uh, Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, as the case may be. I'm on the East Coast, and my name's Steve Song. I work for the Internet Society, which is a relatively new position for me. The last time I addressed the Indigenous Connectivity Summit, I was working with Mozilla, but doing very similar things. And one of the things that I've been working on since about 2008 is democratizing access to radio spectrum for community networks, for small operators, and I hope today to share some of the things that I've learned along the way about spectrum, and maybe kind of try and shortcut some of the stumbling blocks that I had along the way. But I'll turn over to my colleague Darrah. Um,
Hey, Steve. Thanks, Steve. And hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Darrah Blackwater, and I am coming to you today from the headquarters of the Navajo Nation in Window Rock, Arizona. Um, I don't know where you left off, Steve, so I'll just kind of jump into I'll just give like a few seconds of an intro. So I've been working on spectrum issues for I think like about 6 years now, and mostly just focused on this concept of spectrum sovereignty, the idea that spectrum belongs to tribal nations, and that tribal nations should own the spectrum and be able to do whatever they want with the spectrum that is on and over their lands. And I imagine we probably have a different levels of understanding of spectrum. And so, really, the point of this session that Steve and I discussed was to try to explain it in a way for people that people can grasp if you're new to this subject, but also, talk about a few higher level policy things. I'm a little bit short on time today, so I'll be here for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll kick it back over to Steve, which I think I'll actually do right now, Steve, and let you pick up wherever you left off before I jumped on. So thank you all for having me.
Thanks, Darrah. So I'm going to start with an experiment. I hope you'll forgive me in that I've been searching for years for good ways to explain radio spectrum, which is a tough thing to sort of get your head around. And I'm going to try an analogy for you today, which I mean, please, I would love feedback as to whether it resonates or makes sense to you. So. Radio spectrum is a lot like audio spectrum. So, we use sound waves to communicate with each other. We use radio waves for electronic communication. So, if you want to think about spectrum, there are four things that distinguish good communication with spectrum. So, the first one is the obvious one, the transmitter, the person speaking. And if you imagine yourself in a conference room, standing at one side of the conference room and speaking to someone on the other side of the conference room, if you speak louder, there's a greater chance that they're going to hear you. And the other, so those big radio transmitters that transmit at high power, they're going to have further reach than a small Wi-Fi access point, which is speaking, relatively quietly. So that's number one. That's the transmitter. On the other side of the conference room, you have the receiver, the person listening to the communication. And they're an important player too, because the sensitivity of the receiver has a huge impact on how well the communication happens. So if you can imagine, someone is speaking on the other side of the conference room, and I'm standing on the other side, and but there's a 10-year-old beside me. Well, there's a good chance that the 10-year-old may be able to hear what's being said across the room. that I wouldn't hear because the sensitivity of my receivers is lower. And so the quality of the receiver is just as important as the loudness of the transmitter. So that's one and two. The third piece is what's in between. So if there are a divider or something in the conference room, or if you're in the real world, if there are trees, those trees or those dividers, they absorb some of those waves and they interfere with the ability to pick up those sounds. And so that's a factor as well. And the last and maybe the most important factor is who else is in the room. So if suddenly it's not just the two of us in that conference room speaking across it, if the conference room is filled with people talking, then the chances of your voice actually reaching the other person is very small. Not because your voice is reduced, but because the ability to pick out that voice among all of the other voices is diminished. And that's exactly the case with radio communication. And that's why we have spectrum management. And I said is because when there are multiple people in the room, they can't afford to all communicate at the same time because the receivers can't pick up what's the right communication for them. And but there are other things that can change the way we receive. So, for instance, if I had a tin can, remember when you were a kid, the tin can and the string, and I stretched that across the conference room, I could speak relatively quietly into that tin can, and you could pick it up on the other side. So, spectrum can work like a bright light in a room, or it can work like a very focused beam and communicate things over long distance. All of these are factors when considering the management of spectrum. And because that's so complex, we've searched for simpler ways of understanding it. And one of the biggest ways that has come to dominate the way we understand spectrum is basically treating it like property. So, and regulators have begun to treat spectrum as property in order to protect it from interference. So it's if a certain frequency in a certain place is your property, then you have exclusive rights to use it whenever you want. It's as if you had an empty conference room and no one was allowed to go in the conference room and use it because it was all for your purposes. And there are upsides and downsides to using that real estate as a metaphor for spectrum. The upside is that people tend to value what they have paid for and what they own. And when you feel like you own something, you are inclined to treat it better. The downside is that if you're not using your conference room, but you still own it, then you have a lot of wasted space. Or if you're only using a corner of your conference room and a lot of the conference room is unused, um, then there's a lot of potential there, but no activity. So I'll pause there and turn over to Derek and just talk about perhaps your experience of kind of these metaphors that we use to talk about this complex thing called radio spectrum.
Yeah, I think for anyone who feels overwhelmed by, trying to understand what we're talking about, the more that you kind of put yourself in these conversations, I think there's lots of different metaphors and whatever makes it click, it kind of just takes a while. So, if you feel overwhelmed by, spectrum policy and just what spectrum is, it's really okay. Just keep exposing your brain to conversations and the information, and eventually it will click. It just kind of, in my experience, it takes a while. But that said, let me throw a few more at you to hopefully not overwhelm you. You don't have to know all of the things, just kind of take in what makes sense and go from there. But what Steve is explaining is, and really as Indigenous people in policy in general, I find there's often kind of a disconnect and a paradox in a way where we're having to engage with colonial concepts that aren't necessarily natural to Indigenous worldviews a lot of times. And I don't know if I said, excuse my voice, I'm just getting over being sick, so that's why I sound like this. Hopefully everyone can hear me. But by that I mean, what everything that Steve's talking about is incredibly important and relevant to the way that spectrum is managed and licensed by colonial governments, by the government of Canada through the CRTC and ISED, by the government of America through the FCC, um, and um, and so it's important for us to understand the policy implications of these um, governance structures and of these spectrum policies, and this kind of like property structure. And yet I think it's also important to step back from that sometimes as Indigenous people and kind of have our own understanding, and start from where we can meet with this resource and what this resource has meant to us. So for spectrum, taking a step back from the more colonial property rights regime, what we can look at is the relationship that Indigenous people have had to spectrum for thousands and thousands of years before the FCC, before CRTC, before United States and Canada, wherever, even countries. And the ways that we've engaged with spectrum, we've observed it in lightning. We've observed it in rainbows. We observe it in sunlight. These are all spectrum. And so all of this is, we call it spectrum for a reason, because it's lots of different things, lots of different frequencies of these electromagnetic waves that are useful for different things that we experience in different ways. Sunlight is spectrum. When you see a rainbow, you're looking at spectrum. Visible light is spectrum. If you've ever gotten an X-ray, you're having an encounter with spectrum. But there's more natural world, lightning, these natural ways that we've experienced spectrum have always been around. And so when you think about it like that, we have deities, speaking from the Diné perspective, we have deities, we have Johanae, we have Sun Bearer, we have these gods that are kind of in charge of, that's their realm. They dwell in the spectrum realm. They travel over rainbows. They deliver technology that is helpful to us, over rainbows and over lightning and different things like that. So we're really having a small conversation when we're talking about property rights and the way that colonial governments have treated this resource. But when you zoom out, the resource is actually this really amazing thing that we're actually quite familiar with and have our own understanding of. So then bringing it into the now and the modern uses of spectrum and the way that technology has made it so valuable, and the fact that it's somewhat scarce, but now we have different technology that's allowing us to share it more effectively. These are the changing ways that we're having these conversations around spectrum, and different spectrum that's becoming more relevant. The satellite to straight to cell phone is a total game changer. I think it's in beta testing right now, but that's really going to change things and make some spectrum more valuable than others. But hopefully that gives a little bit of big picture context to what it is that we're talking about. I'm about to have to jump off. Steve, is there anything else that you think that I need to cover before I jump? I've got to go to another meeting.
Maybe you could just touch briefly on what's going on in the US.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. So we at the Navajo Nation wrote a letter to Chairman Carr, who is the head of the FCC, and we essentially were sort of forcing the hand to have for them to take comments on another tribal priority window. So this is similar to what Canada is doing now with cellular and PCS spectrum. This is similar to what we saw back in 2020 in the United States with 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. And so there's not necessarily another tribal priority window planned, but essentially we sort of wrote this letter asking for them to open comments so that they can understand the need and the success of the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, and hopefully apply that and open another window for AWS3 and upper C-band spectrum. And so, excuse me, that would be really, really valuable for tribes. And So for anyone on the US side, the comments are open now. And if you want to follow up with me, or, I think Mark is on top of this too. If not, maybe we can work together to put out some kind of info on this. But anyone on the US side who has an interest in, another tribal priority window, they're taking comments until the end of the month. And so that's going to be really important to get those comments in and basically just say, the first tribal priority window was a huge success. We absolutely want tribal priority windows open on these other, before these other auctions for these spectrum bands, and these are the ways that it can be improved last time. Which a big part of that is going to be getting rid of the urban rural distinction and making all tribes eligible equally is what we'll be arguing for on behalf of everyone too. So thank you for reminding me of that, Steve. And I do have to jump off. Mark and Phil know how to reach me if you need to reach me, and I hope it's a great rest of the conference. So thank you all.
Thanks, Darrah. So what I would add to that is the fact that the good news about technology is that it has evolved a great deal in the last 20 to 30 years. And so while it used to be that exclusivity was the only way to deal with spectrum, now spectrum sharing is much more of a reality. And so, we see ISED having introduced the access licensing framework and the non-competitive local licensing framework. These are huge step forward in terms of access to spectrum, especially for local access to spectrum, and really will have the potential to change the way we think about managing spectrum, but it's still very early days. But I think it's really important to understand those two pieces of regulatory change in order to take full advantage of them. Having said that, the property rights regime is something that has been taken advantage of by some Indigenous groups. So. Yeah, I don't know if for those of you who are able to hear Anthony Royal speak at the last Indigenous Connectivity Summit, I mean, he told an amazing story about how the Maori had gained access and their own property rights to 100 megahertz of 5G spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz range. And this has given them huge leverage. It's given them the power to negotiate directly with incumbent operators and to sublease spectrum back to the incumbent operators and to operate on a peer-to-peer level with the incumbents. And so it has resulted in a huge power shift. So I think there's a lot to learn from other parts of the world in terms of how spectrum sovereignty conversations are going. And I think the deeper you can get into the issue of spectrum policy, the more possibilities can emerge from that, because I think there is opportunity for a lot of creativity in terms of forging an equitable and robust solution for spectrum access. So I'll pause there if I may, and if there are questions or comments or specific things you would like to dig into, I'm happy to delve further on those issues. If not, I can carry on a bit and talk about some other elements of the kind of spectrum analogy.
This is great, Steve. Thank you. A good moment for a pause. Can you still hear us loud and clear?
Loud and clear.
The crowd went wild for Darrah. And for you, pretty good. No. This is a functioning mic, and we do have two-way here. Do we have any questions or comments for Steve and or Darrah? Darrah's not here, but I mean,
I can run.
Thank you for that very, very interesting presentation. My name is Keith Matthew. I'm from the Shuswap Nation here in British Columbia, up near Kamloops. And I'm wondering how we can, as Indigenous people, take advantage of those opportunities in not only using the spectrum, but how can we harness it for our own uses? Because it seems like that spectrum is being almost, I guess, the major telecoms here in Canada have got the majority of the money and the benefit and are keeping us out of that particular space. So how do we take advantage of the opportunity there? I don't know if you have any thoughts around that, but be really interested in hearing more.
Yeah, I think it is generally true that the existing regime around spectrum management has served to um, exclude small operators in general. So typically, small operators rely on Wi-Fi to deliver access services, and that has been, Wi-Fi technology is quite incredible, and what ISPs are doing with it is tremendous. But they are excluded from access to, to mobile spectrum, for instance, and so I think lobbying for access to that spectrum, whether it's through the existing mechanisms of the non-competitive local license or the access spectrum framework, is key because what that changes is it changes your capacity as a service provider to be able to deliver, more sustainable, higher capacity broadband to your community, so or communities. And so breaking down these kind of monolithic spectrum licenses to create frameworks that allow more granular access to spectrum, so that it isn't kind of a monolithic spectrum license that covers an entire region, but that can be broken down, I think is absolutely key. And and things like the priority windows, which give preferential access to Indigenous peoples to access that spectrum, are a very, very positive step. Um, I think perhaps there is more that could be done in terms of rebalancing the playing field in terms of spectrum access. And I think key to that is becoming um, a part of the conversation and a regular part of the conversation with ISED and I think that's already happening, but it also means deepening the number of people who have the knowledge and capacity to engage on the kinds of consultations that ISED is conducting, to be able to say, well, maybe this isn't the way to go forward. Maybe we have to look at things a different way, because often it is the complexity of the consultation that intimidates people from participating. And spectrum is about as complex as it gets, and a lot of the language and wording is intimidating for me, and I've been doing this a long time. So I think, if I would say one thing, I would say building the capacity of, the people to engage on the policy side of things, and to become a regular part of the ongoing conversations around this is absolutely key. And also, I would say you have to be prepared for a marathon, not a sprint. The changes in spectrum, as you may already have observed, don't happen in months. They definitely happen in years, and sometimes they happen in decades. In terms of the Maori and their, amazing win of having 100 megahertz of 3.5 gigahertz spectrum assigned to them, That was roughly a 20-year battle led by Anthony Royal and his colleagues, and it's a huge win. But it is something you have to be prepared for. That these kinds of things, because they involve manufacturers, the International Telecommunications Union, national regulatory agencies, you have to have be prepared for a longer term engagement. Sorry, that's probably not a very encouraging thing to say, but it's just a reality that it is unlike software development or technology development, which can happen in months, spectrum policy happens in years.
Thank you. We have a follow-up, Steve.
Just one final question before you take the other one, but it's Keith Matthew again, and I'd like to suggest that to the Indigenous people in the room that we aim for our own Indigenous telecom and ownership of that spectrum. We've never given up jurisdiction, and I know there's communities in the room that were advocating for our own spectrum in their discussions with Canada. And that's where I think we have to aim as Indigenous people. We've never given up that right to the airwaves, and other people have just assumed ownership without any consultation or accommodation of our inherent rights or title. So that's what I'd like to think that we should aim at. Cookstem.
We got one more question, Steve, coming.
And also just Stephen, your remarks about it's not very encouraging. There's a little story that we have as Indigenous people. I know most nations where we think 7 generations ahead. So we are about the marathon.
Yeah, thank you very much. Both comments are well taken. Leonie Rivers from the National Indigenous Connectivity Inc. group, or NICHI for most fairly new. We have been mandated by the Assembly of First Nations to help bring together all the folks that are in this room and others to try to look at our common interest. And as my colleague had said over there regarding we need to have a First Nations perspective, my question to you, Steve, and we've worked together and we are working on the International Spectrum Policy Working Group. So it's nice to see you again. My question is, in terms of the spectrum sovereignty, what are your comments about that in terms of Canada, Mexico, and New Zealand?
Wow, you kind of put me on the spot. I think that I mean the first thing I would say is there's a huge amount to learn from each other. If my colleague Eric Huerta from Mexico is there with you, and he is a fountain of knowledge, and what he has achieved through his organization Redis and Radiosematica in Mexico is remarkable. And so I think it would be great to see a global Indigenous Spectrum Summit because I think there are so many different ways of approaching access to spectrum that I think it would be inspiring to discover those different approaches. I mean, I have to say that even after years of kind of invested in understanding spectrum, last year Anthony Royal blew my mind because the way they have taken advantage of the spectrum in New Zealand is not what I expected. I expected them to build their own kind of 5G network and provide services. But they haven't done that. What they've done is they've leased back most of that spectrum to the incumbent operators and used the revenue that they've gotten from leasing that spectrum back to the operators to actually engage in capacity building and training network engineers and building smaller local networks. So I mean, and that was a possibility that had never occurred to me. So I think the opportunities to learn from other experiences around the world is one that should definitely be seized on.
We're having another pause here, and I'm looking around the room and seeing if we have any follow-ups or other questions and comments. We have about 5 minutes left, Steve. Oh, there we go. I'm doing your job for you, Jewel.
Hi, Steve. Gordon Gow from the University of Alberta. So you mentioned the long timeline and the international connections. And I'm thinking about World Radio Conferences, where a lot of the high-level agendas are set for radio spectrum, and manufacturers are there. All of the folks are there. Is there representation of Indigenous voices at the World Radio Conference? And when is the next one? And is there a window of opportunity for Indigenous voices to be stronger at that conference?
So the World Radio Conference is mostly about what frequencies are allowed to be used for. So what frequencies will we use for radio? What will we use for television? What will we use for mobile broadband? And they're not necessarily about granting rights to that spectrum, because that tends to happen done by national regulators. That said, that's not to say that there isn't a need or a space for a voice for Indigenous people at the World Radio Conference. I think I would defer to my colleague Eric, who is much deeper in knowledge about the ITU than I am, to talk about that. So I don't know if Eric is available, but I think he would be the best person to answer that question in detail.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. It's I miss you. And yeah, well, the thing is, as Steve said, the radio conference is more for allocations to decide where what would be the use of a specific band. So the other is a matter of policy, and this is more about the WTDC, the World Telecommunications Development Conference, where they come recommendations, are also they decide where are the matters of study of the groups of study, and some of them are about a spectrum allocation, or for a specific how a specific group can access to spectrum. No? So it's more a matter of policy regarding connectivity policy, and this is it's more about of this WTDC conference that is going to be this year. And also we share a document with the government of Canada regarding Indigenous peoples matters. There is a special resolution for Indigenous peoples I think it's resolution 46. And that's important that some of the matters that you consider should be studied by the ITUD or shared should be included into that resolution. That resolution talks about a spectrum for Indigenous communities as well.
And the only thing I would add to what Eric said is that the ITU, the only way into the ITU in terms of decision making is through countries. So happily, the Canadian government has been a champion at the ITU for the voice of Indigenous peoples, and similarly, the Eric Huerta has been part of the Mexican delegation in terms of pushing forward that resolution. But the extent to which you can influence the representation at the ITU through national governments is I think the only formal way of making sure that voices are heard.
So, Steve, who owns the spectrum?
Nobody. I think that it is, it's a construct, right? It is, when you point an antenna up, and you point an antenna sideways, the spectrum doesn't interfere with each other. For instance, if we go back briefly to this room metaphor, if everybody's talking at a round table around the room, and let's say you have 20 round tables in the room, and everybody's having a conversation, then everybody's speaking quietly at the table and everyone can hear each other. And everyone's using the same spectrum, the same audio spectrum, yet because people are speaking quietly, everyone can hear each other effectively. And that's kind of like how Wi-Fi works, right? Wi-Fi devices are quiet by definition, and by rules. And so when you say who owns the spectrum, yeah, it isn't. It's a kind of space that we play in, and sometimes it's useful to describe it as if there were ownership to it, but it's so complex that I think by using purely a kind of real estate metaphor for spectrum, we deliberately blind ourselves to some of the possibilities and the complexity of spectrum.
Correct. Okay, Steve, I want to just survey the room one more time. Do we have any final questions or comments? We're winding down here for our first panel. Okay, we do have one more. One last one. Last one, Steve. I'm running over there.
Warren Callan from iValley. You've touched on how the licensing process is challenging for people to get into, especially small providers. But there is opportunity outside of Wi-Fi, and I'd like to hear your opinion on the introduction of TV white space for utilizing a lot of the connectivity for unlicensed requirements.
Well, TV white space is how I got into the issue of spectrum access, and back in 2008 started lobbying for access to TV white space spectrum in South Africa, and I think it was a brilliant idea, and still is to some degree, of using these empty television channels for broadband access. Um, there's a kind of relationship between policymakers and manufacturers that exists in order to have a kind of success. And so um, uh, policymakers, need to say, yes, we think TV white space is a good idea, and here are the rules how you can do it, which is a signal for manufacturers to say, great, we'll manufacture loads of TV white space equipment, and hope that a market emerges. But there's a kind of signaling between the two, in that the policymaker may say, well, there isn't much equipment, maybe we shouldn't bother regulating this. And so I think TV white space kind of got stuck in this process of policymakers waiting for signals from the manufacturing world, and the manufacturers waiting for signals from the regulators. And unfortunately, a lot of potential was lost. I still think it's a good technology, and but it has taken a very, very long time to get regulations for, and I think it still occupies a kind of niche role, but I think there is probably more potential in the non-competitive local licensing and access licensing frameworks, because there are more manufacturers producing, what they call private LTE or private 5G equipment that can be used for service delivery than there are manufacturers producing TV white space equipment. Which is not to say that I have huge respect for the TV white space manufacturers who have stuck it out, like Six Harmonics and others. But I think it has sort of been it's suffered a little bit of not quite the death, but the wounds of 1,000 cuts in and not quite living up to its potential. That said, I would still have it as part of my toolkit when I was trying to figure out what is the best access technology. I wouldn't discard TV white space by any means, but I would also be looking at these other frameworks.
Last one. Thank you, Steve.
Steve. Thank you very much. I'm Karim Lakhani from Advanced Interactive. Can you talk about ISED's rural remote broadband services spectrum that they authorized in 2009 and how it operates in the same space as TV white space, and why ISED has decided to abandon the technology or fight against it?
Well, I'm skating on the limits of my knowledge here, but I think as a rural broadband technology, it was abandoned because of the increasing standardization of other technologies, like LTE and 5G technologies now kind of dominate the access world, and so you can do fixed wireless, 5G, and also fixed wireless Wi-Fi now in 6 gigahertz is coming. But there are other more standardized technologies that are probably better options, even though I know it's been difficult for service providers who had entire networks based on that technology to make a transition. The challenge that regulators have is they have to look at the manufacturing world and where the manufacturing trends are and try and match the regulation to give operators access to the widest range of the most affordable technologies. But yeah, there are others, I think, that know a great deal more about that story than I do, though.
Thank you so much, Steve. We're going to leave it there. And can we all give Darrah and Steve a round of applause, please? Did you get any of that, Steve? We're clapping for you.
Thank you very much. I would just say it's a privilege to be able to address you, and I'm sorry not to be there in person. I really urge you to take advantage of my colleague Eric Huerta, who has probably forgotten more about Spectrum than I know, and that if you have any follow-up questions at all about Spectrum, please. My details are available through Phil or Mark, and I encourage you to get in touch because I never get bored of talking about it.
Thanks so much, Steve, and take care. All the best, and we'll be in contact soon. Bye-bye.